Hello everyone, before this video starts, I would appreciate if you guys would leave a like and subscribe, since your support means the world to me and allows me to make these types of videos. Now let's get into the video. Unlocking things that are meant to stay locked has always fascinated me. When I was a kid, I would go around the entire house getting my little digits on anything that was behind a closed door. Even at one point getting caught by my parents emptying their sock drawer just because I felt like it. It was annoying to my mom, but my dad found it hilarious. And by the time I just started middle school, my dad bought me my first lock-picking set behind my mom's back. Our little hobby we could enjoy with each other. I quickly gained infamy in middle and high school as the girl who could pick any lock that needed unlocking. I got into lockers, locked doors, and cabinets like nothing, and got in trouble plenty of times because of it. It was to the point that I was one more lock away from expulsion in my junior year. So with the threat of my murder at the hands of my mother if I was expelled, I quit lockpicking for the rest of my school career. Not cold turkey, of course. I continued to practice at home and outside of school to my heart's content. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't using this to break into people's houses to rob them. That wasn't my style at the time. But I did use it to get into places I wasn't supposed to. Abandoned houses, off-limit areas, even just those random padlocks on the sides of bridges. Somehow I managed to stay out of trouble and graduate from high school, and it seemed that my life began to go downhill the very moment that diploma was given to me. A few months after graduation, my dad had lost his job. My city was a large industrial zone, and it was heavily affected by the recession. The plant that my dad worked at had employed a good chunk of the town, and with its closure, plenty of people were now in danger of losing their homes. My dad was one of those people. Despite everything, he tried to keep an outward appearance of calm, but I could tell how badly he was affected by the mounting bills. At the same time, I was unable to find work right out of high school, as with the plant's closure, the job opportunities dried up faster than a sponge on a stove. College had never been something I had wanted to do, so I had banked on finding a job to maintain myself, but with so few opportunities now available to me, I decided to do something that until then I had sworn I'd never do. I started using my lockpicking skills to break into abandoned stores and take items to sell to others. If the store wasn't going to sell them, I sure as hell was. I eventually roped a few of my friends into a little team of robbers to help me. I think I did this mostly to try and justify my choices, since with other people with me, I could unlock the door and allow them to rob the place. It wasn't much better, but offered me some dissociation from the crime. On this day, my three other friends, Jess, Tom, and Jeff, were out late at night and hitting our third and final store. Kneeling before the door, I was in the zone as I tried to get the tumblers to cooperate with me. But something about this lock differed from the thousands of others I had opened before. Every bit of progress I made was just as quickly undone. "Mace, hurry up, man. Someone is going to see us," Jess said in her usual tone of apprehension whenever we did this. Mace was my preferred nickname, since saying Macedonia out loud was certainly a mouthful to most people. I quickly waved her away as I suddenly started making more progress. My eyes grew wide as I felt the lock ready to give. What even was this store? I asked no one in particular, far too focused on the progress I was making on the strange lock. Jess wasn't much help as she continued looking up and down the street to see if anyone would notice us, even though this entire section of town was completely abandoned by businesses and especially by cops. "A voodoo shop," Tom said, as he tried to peer into the windows of the shop to try and see if anything could be seen. But on top of the fact that the sun was setting, the windows of the shop were completely caked in dust from the inside, making it completely impossible to figure out what was inside the store. By the look of things, this shithole was abandoned even before everything went tits up. Jeff sighed as he blew a cloud of smoke from his mouth. Along with Jess, he was serving as a lookout, though at that moment he was more concerned with finishing his cigarette. "My grandma told me about this place and that it was cursed or whatever." "The fact it's a voodoo shop probably aids in that assumption," Tom said as he pulled his face away from the window and looked over at me. I had my tongue out as I fished around for the final tumbler, and finally, with one last satisfying click, I quickly grabbed the door handle and yanked it down. The old wooden door opened and a small rusty bell jingled our arrival to the empty shop. "All right, kids, do your thing," I told my friends as I pulled my hook tool out of the keyhole and stood aside for them to enter the shop. Robbing wasn't my style. I got my thrill from unlocking the doors, not from stealing shit. Jeff and Tom were quick to enter the store, but Jess hesitated at the entrance. "I've got a really bad feeling about this mace," she told me as I carefully packaged my tools and placed them into my jacket pocket. Jess was always the scaredy cat in our group and acted sort of like our moral compass. Honestly, if things weren't so bad in the city, then she wouldn't be doing something like this at all. "It's gonna be okay, Jess. Just quick, in and out like always." I smiled and patted her on the back. That didn't do much to reassure her, but it was enough to get her to enter the store. I leaned against the store wall and acted as the new lookout. If all went well, we could usually clear out an area as quickly as 15 minutes. Sure, that wasn't exactly enough time to get most of the valuables, but it was enough time to get a decent enough haul. I looked down at my wristwatch and watched the second hand tick away. It was eerily quiet, and it started getting on my nerves the longer it went on. There wasn't even any wind, not even a small, distant break of glass. It was dead silent, and I suddenly started feeling like how Jess usually did. I stared back down at my watch, and I felt vomit build up in my throat. Somehow, in that short moment of panic, an entire half hour had passed. "Shit," I mumbled out as I looked back at the store. Not a sound came from inside, not any talking or even the sound of things getting moved around. It was like I was in a bubble of silence that let no sound whatsoever through. I stared at the entrance to the store and hoped that suddenly they would come bursting out of the store with the things they'd stolen. I started panicking the longer that it was taking them to exit. Finally, after a few more minutes, I reached out and opened the door to the shop. The sad, rusty bell jingled and announced my arrival. The inside of the shop was completely covered in dust and cobwebs. Jeff had been right in thinking that this place had been abandoned much longer than the other buildings we'd broken into. And yet the entire store was completely stocked with items for sale. Potions and charms lined the shelves, and by the cash register, there was an entire wall of voodoo dolls. Each of them was different and wearing clothes with black button eyes that seemed to follow me the more I walked around the store. "Guys," I called out, wondering where the hell they even were. That eerie silence continued to follow me, and it was as if I could hear every single squeak of the floorboards and every breath I let out. There wasn't a single sign of my friends at all. I was about to leave and try to call them, but suddenly the ring of a bell pulled my attention over to the register. There, standing behind the register, was Jess. But she looked off, very off. She had a giant smile on her face, and her eyes were almost as large as her smile was. She slowly turned her head to look at me in a very janky way. Her eyes moved in a couple of directions before they focused on me. "We shouldn't have come here, Macedonia," she told me in a chipper voice that instantly put me in a fight or flight mode. In the 5 years I'd known Jess, she'd never once called me by my full name, and it immediately creeped me out. "Jess, what's wrong with you?" I asked her as I started backing up towards the entrance to the store. Her eyes followed me as she stayed still at the register. "Where are Tom and Jeff?" I asked her. She tilted her head at me and slowly narrowed her eyes at me, the smile never leaving her face. "They're dead," she said with a laugh I'd never heard her make. My heart started beating so fast that it felt like it was going to burst right out of my chest, and I quickly turned around to leave. Running to the door and grabbing the lever, I was shocked to discover that somehow it had locked itself from the other side. "What the fuck is going on?" I screamed, pounding my fists on the door before turning back around to look at Jess staring at me at the counter, her laughs turning into cackles as I noticed that something was sticking out of her back and forcing her to sway side to side as she laughed. Noticing that my eyes were focused on the foreign object sticking out of her back, the smile on her face somehow grew wider. "I think she noticed, sir," she said through her cackles. I watched as her eyes rolled up inside of her head, and someone began to stand up from underneath the register. The person was giant and gaunt, with a freshly pressed and clean suit that somehow fit him perfectly despite his frail appearance. His black hair was a mess of curls and knots, a stitched-up mouth curled up into a horrible smile, and his skin was whiter than chalk was, with buttons for eyes and more stitches that appeared to be keeping his head attached to his shoulders. "Shame on you for not introducing us, Jessica," he said with a hoarse southern accent. With his other arm, he reached below the register again and produced a top hat to complete his ridiculously horrifying look. Jess's eyes suddenly rolled back down and her head quickly jerked to look at the monster that was nonchalantly having an arm on her back. "But you already know who she is, sir." She giggled at him before her eyes again rolled back into her head and he pulled his arm out of her back with a sick, wet pop. Jess suddenly went limp and slammed her face into the counter, revealing that her entire backside had been ripped open and everything scooped out of her. My, Miss Macedonia, ain't your daddy ever teach you not to break into stores?" The monster said with a yellow-toothy grin, so giant he was about to rip the stitches right off of his face. I frantically looked around the store for anything to defend myself with, as my eyes again settled on the lifeless body of Jess left on the register. I could only imagine what the sick fuck had done with Jeff and Tom. "Who the fuck are you?" I demanded to know from him, reaching into my pocket and trying to find anything that might protect me. But in the brief second that I looked down when I pulled out my mini pocket knife, he had somehow appeared before me, sending me into a screaming fit. He stood there for a moment as I began to cry and damn near piss myself. "Y'all are breaking into my store and don't even have the common courtesy to read the sign?" He hissed in disappointment and pointed a blood-stained glove above my head. I thought he was about to finish me off right then and there, but instead he was pointing above me. I spared a glance and looked at the wooden sign hung up over the door. Old King Creole's half-priced voodoo store. "King Creole?" I whimpered as I looked back at his pale face. He nodded and took off his hat, doing a dramatic bow before me. "Please, sir, we thought this place was..." He quickly held up a finger to my face and softly shushed me. Standing straight again, he slowly brought his finger to his mouth to continue shushing me. "Your friends already gave me the same spiel. That don't automatically make you in the right, I'm afraid," he said with a chuckle as he switched from shushing me to tapping his long fingers against his face in thought. "Now what am I going to do with you?" He was practically giddy with excitement over what he was going to do to me. "Please, I'll do anything, just please don't hurt me," I screamed at him, feebly holding the knife in front of me. Something about what I said pulled him out of his giddy imagination, but the smile remained on his face as he suddenly grabbed me by the shoulders and shoved his entire face into mine. "Anything," he hissed with excitement. I half expected his breath to be horrendous, but oddly enough, it didn't smell like anything at all. That, along with his sudden interest in me, quickly got me to nod in agreement. "Wonderful. Then how about this, Macedonia, my dear?" He let go of me and quickly ordered me to follow him as he practically skipped his way past the register. Mace," I mumbled at him, but he was already too far away to have heard me. I sheepishly followed after him as I wiped my face of tears and boogers and placed the pocket knife back in its home. I quickly ran past Jess's dead body and just did my best to avoid eye contact with anything, following after King Creole as he took me into the back room and into his office. "In exchange for your life, Mace." That caught me off guard since he somehow had heard my nickname. "You'll do 5 jobs for me. Should be simple with a woman of your skills of lockpicking. In exchange for that, I shall promise that nothing will happen to you," he said with a smile, and he looked around his desk for something. It seemed too good to be true, and there was definitely going to be something attached to this, but at the same time I couldn't really argue with him. If anything, these jobs would ensure that I kept on living at least a little longer. "What kind of jobs?" I asked him after some hesitation. He quickly spun around on his heels and produced a drawing for me. I looked down at it and was greeted by a flannel-wearing voodoo doll with a beard and a little axe to go with. "What am I supposed to do?" I asked him with some confusion. He chuckled and sat in his chair staring at me with his button eyes and creeping me out to no end. "Break into that address and bring back that doll to me. Seems one of my store clerks sold him without telling me, and I'd rather have him back here safely in the store than out and about." I was about to ask what address, but it suddenly began to appear on the paper in front of me above the doll. "That's one job." He held up a finger to me and wagged it back and forth. "Complete this job and then I'll contact you for another one at a later date. Understand?" he asked with a smile. I stared at the paper and tried to work out the address in my head. It was local and was maybe a half-hour walk from our current location. Okay, I told him, folding the drawing and stuffing it into my pocket. I stood there awkwardly before I started turning around to go and do the job, before he grabbed my shoulder from behind and draped a necklace out in front of my face. Almost forgot. You might need this. He chuckled as I held my hand out for the necklace and he dropped it into my hand. It was a simple rope necklace with a strange talisman attached to it. If that little fellow is causing you issues, just show him that. Should clear everything up. He patted my shoulder and finally let me out of his office. I could feel his gaze on me as I slowly and shakily made my way back out onto the shop floor and made my way to the door. Even when I was sure we had broken the line of sight, it felt like he was still staring deep into my soul. As I reached out to open the door, it opened for me, and I quickly exited the shop. Despite that, it still felt as if he was watching me from somewhere. I panted softly as my knees gave out, and I collapsed to the sidewalk and threw up into the street. As I wiped the bile from my mouth, I stared down at my watch and felt another drop kick to my stomach. According to my watch, that entire ordeal had lasted only a full minute. Terrified by the power that King Creole possessed, I quickly got up from the floor and went about heading towards my destination. The walk there was uneventful, but if you had seen me walking down the sidewalk, you would have thought that I was paranoid, which I most certainly fucking was. At every noise that was made near me, I looked back expecting to see that tall bastard following after me. Every 5 steps I felt the need to look behind me, or next to me, or even fucking above me in the sky. My heart had calmed down a bit, but it was now again pounding as I neared my destination. It was one of the last nice suburbs left in the city, and the address pointed to it being a house in the neighborhood. I wasn't exactly new to breaking into houses, but this would be the first time that I would ever break into one that wasn't abandoned or condemned. The sense of paranoia that King Creole was following me suddenly turned into paranoia of someone from one of the other houses seeing me breaking in. I arrived at the house to find it completely dark. I swallowed a rising lump of bile and anxiety in my throat and dug into my pocket. Taking out the note, I double-checked to be sure that this was the place and then pulled out my tools. I was fortunate enough that the family living here had several plants on their porch, which served to keep me hidden from view. If you were to look at me and know I was there, it was obvious, but a passing person wouldn't be able to see me. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I attempted to pick the lock to the home. It was a simple lock, and yet my hand just wouldn't cooperate with me. I had the necklace that King Creole gave me tied up in my hand like it was some crucifix, and I was about to go fight some vampires, and this strange talisman thing was shaking around as my hands tried to do the thing that I had done countless times before. Common, just fucking. I was getting pissed at myself for not only not being able to pick a lock, but also for getting myself into this whole situation. But soon the rhythm began to return to my movements as I fished with my hook tool and was finally able to get the tumblers to cooperate and open the door for me. I let out a relieved sigh and quickly entered the house. I was glad to see that this family didn't have an alarm system, and this would hopefully be a quick job. The house was dark and illuminated only by the setting sun, but I was still too scared to turn the lights on, so I made do with the limited amount of sun that I had to work with. I quickly made my way into the living room and frantically began searching for the voodoo doll. It was when I was looking under the couch for it that I heard a rhythmic slapping sound, like someone hitting a wet mop against a hard surface. At first, I thought it was someone coming down the stairs, but after a few seconds it continued. I tried to ignore it and continue my search for the doll, but it was soon obvious that it wasn't in the living room. I looked over at the family pictures and saw that they had a kid, which made me even more ashamed of what I was doing. But it also showed me that the doll was mostly likely upstairs in their son's room. As I made my way over to the staircase, that sound grew louder and louder. On instinct, I pulled out my knife again and started slowly making my way up the staircase. As I did so, the sound grew louder, but was also coupled with a cracking sound. As I made it to the top of the stairs, the carpet on the stairs suddenly became very soggy. In the dim light, I thought that maybe their bathtub had flooded. But as I leaned down to touch the carpet, I was horrified to see that it wasn't water. It was blood. The puddle of blood was coming from the room just to the left of the stairs, and against my better judgment, I took a peek inside. I was horrified to see a man in a flannel swinging an axe down over two horribly mangled corpses. That's where that sound had been coming from. I was able to put two and two together to realize that this guy had been the voodoo doll. But I had no idea how I was going to get him back to King Creole. But that wasn't going to matter if I was about to end up like the family here. I started back down the stairs, but I hadn't noticed how far the blood had traveled. And my first step resulted in my falling down the stairs and landing flat on my ass. I sat there, stinging in pain all over, before I was suddenly horribly reminded about what I had just seen. I quickly looked back up the stairs and had to cover my mouth before I screamed. The axe man was staring down at me with a crazed look on his face and smacking the blunt part of his axe against his palm. "First day of freedom, and I already get to kill someone else." His husky voice chuckled as he started walking down the stairs towards me. He cackled as he slapped the axe against his palm with each step he took toward me. I quickly looked around for anything that could help me and suddenly remembered the necklace. "Stay back!" I screamed out as I held up my hand with the talisman wrapped around my hand. He reached the end of the stairs and kept coming toward me as I frantically backed up. I held it up toward him and prayed that it would do something. He lifted the axe over his head and was about to bring it down on me when a sudden flash of bright light enveloped the two of us. The axe fell right between my legs and got me to scream out in fear. But as I blinked away the last of the blinding light's effects, I saw that the Axeman had disappeared, replaced with the voodoo doll of him. I sat there for a few seconds before I let out a few pained laughs. As I picked up the doll from the floor, I suddenly started hearing crying coming from upstairs. I looked up and saw the son staring down at me and crying. It was certainly some consolation that he hadn't been killed. But now there was the issue that he had seen me. "Hey, sweetie," I told him. He must have been no older than 7 or 8. It's okay. I took care of the bad man. You just call 911, okay? Can you do that for me?" I asked him. He sniffled and quickly nodded before walking over to another room, which I assumed was one with a phone. I quickly stuffed the voodoo doll into my pocket and left the house as quickly as I could, not even bothering to lock the door since the cops would most likely be not too far behind. When I returned to the voodoo shop, Creole was simply ecstatic to see me, and when I produced the voodoo doll, I thought he was going to die from happiness. I watched as he took the doll from me and pinned it back to the wall of voodoo dolls. There were so many of them, and I got the sudden and horrible realization that they were all people turned into dolls. "You did a wonderful job, Mace," he told me with a hard slap to the back. "That's 1 down and 4 to go," he said with a happy chuckle. I felt my knees wobble at the thought of what he was possibly going to make me do now. It wasn't like I would be able to tell him no. I didn't want to end up like my friends or like the people turned into voodoo dolls on his wall, or even worse if I were to tell him no. So for the time being, I'm in his debt until I can pay it off. Fuck my life. After completing my first task for King Creole, I couldn't leave my room for days. I was lucky that he didn't seem to have another task for me right after retrieving his lost axe-murdering voodoo doll. That left me time to rot in my room and frantically clip at my nails with a nail clipper, something I did whenever I was in an especially horrible mood. If my dad hadn't entered my room, I probably wouldn't have had any nails left to clip. "Hey, sweetheart," he said as he entered my room. I could tell just from his tone of voice how exhausted he was. He'd gotten 2 jobs to cope with the loss of his factory job, but these jobs were hard work for barely enough pay. He was working himself to the bone for me and my mom, and yet he was still here trying to check in on me. "What's the matter?" "You haven't left your room in days," he asked and sat down beside me in bed, quickly taking my nail clippers before I could destroy any more of my nails. "I did. Something really bad, Daddy," I said as I tucked my knees under my chin. I couldn't begin to figure out how to tell him that my now dead friends and I had pissed off some evil voodoo man and know I was forced to do his bidding until he decided that I had sufficiently served him. And I still wasn't convinced that he wouldn't kill me at the end of my tasks. "Judging by your expression, you can't really find a way to explain it to me, huh?" he asked me as he put an arm around me and pulled me close to him. He could read me like an open book and always seemed to be able to read my mind, although I doubt he couldn't even begin to understand my situation. "Whatever you've gotten yourself into, sweetie, I know you can get yourself back out of it. And if not, I will always be here to help you no matter what. Understand? And it was just the kind of thing my dad could always tell me to make me feel better. Just that simple affirmation that he would always be here was enough to keep me going. I pulled my face out from my knees and offered him a small kiss on the cheek and a smile. Thanks, Daddy. You're the best, I told him as I wiped the tears in my eyes. He nodded, wrapping an arm around me again and pulled me to him, kissing me back. He left soon afterward to collapse into bed until he had to wake up for another shift. I sat in bed for a few minutes before standing up and leaving my room for the first time in days. And as if on cue, my phone began to ring in my hands. I looked down at it and felt my blood freeze as I saw who was calling me. King Creole was the contact who was calling me, and yet I had never given him my phone number. I hesitated to answer and contemplated even hanging up on him or letting it go to voicemail. But I wasn't about to bring whatever voodoo powers he had on top of my family, so I answered it after a few seconds of indecision. The marvelous Miss Mace. I was beginning to think I had the wrong number. Creole's southern accent came pouring out of my phone. That didn't make much sense to me, since he somehow knew my phone number and had even somehow gotten my phone to know it was him. So I chalked it up as some kind of joke he was making. "What can I do for you, sir?" I asked him how a minimum wage worker might respond. If he was upset by my lack of laughter or joy in his call, he certainly didn't let it show as he continued with his cheery call to me. "Drop by the shop and I'll let you know what I need returned to me. Take your time," he said with a chuckle as he hung up on me before I could answer him. I sighed as I let my phone drop to my bed and groaned loudly. I shoved my face into my hands and felt like ripping it off. But I needed to do these favors if I didn't want to end up like my friends. So after a couple of slaps to my cheeks, I left my room and quickly ran past my parents and into the street. The walk to the shop was uneventful, and soon I was again standing in front of the shop. It felt strange being back here. I had a horrible feeling about this place now that hadn't existed when I had first broken in. But I didn't have a choice. So sucking it up as much as I could, I entered the shop, the sad, roosie bell heralding my arrival. "Mace, so lovely to see you again." Creole was waiting for me at the register and had his hat on the counter in front of him. Come, come." He quickly waved me over as he stood back up and quickly placed the hat back on his head. Underneath the hat was a small voodoo doll. It didn't appear to be anyone specific, and it was staring up at me with a stink eye. It clearly wasn't happy to see me at all. "What's my task this time, sir?" I asked, trying to keep my disdain for him at a minimum. It was hard to be enthusiastic around him, especially with what I had already done for him. But whatever enthusiasm I lacked, he made up for it in spades. "I'm so glad that you asked, Mace," he said as he put his arm around me and pulled me into his chest. He didn't have much of a sense of personal space. I went practically limp as he pulled me behind the register and sat me down on the chair behind it. "I need you to break into another house. But this time, you're going to get me something I want instead of something I lost." Once his sentence was done, he let out a little hum at the end. His excitement just pissed me off. "What exactly is it, sir?" I asked him, losing the battle of making it look like I gave a shit anymore. He held up a photo between his fingers and flipped his wrist to show me the full photo. Staring back at me was an ornate clock that seemed to be made of gold and encrusted with rubies. "Are you asking me to break into a museum?" I asked sarcastically. This clock looked like something that belonged at Versailles, and certainly not something that would be so easy for me to steal. "I can assure you it's not. If that was the case, I could easily find an easier way of getting it. No, I got a tip about it selling on the underground art market, and I've wanted this here clock for quite a while." "So be a doll and go get it for me?" he said with that creepy smile still plastered on his face. I couldn't get used to him. His overly cheery demeanor, his stitches, his button eyes, everything about him just screamed at me to run away. And yet I couldn't. I sighed and reached out for the photo. But before I could take it, he quickly pulled his hand back and produced his other gloved hand to me. In that hand was a pair of earplugs. "What are these for?" I asked him hesitantly. I took them and examined them. They appeared to be just normal earplugs. Something special about that clock. Otherwise, I wouldn't be too interested in it, he told me through a large smile and chuckles. "It's in your best interest that once you break into this house, you put these on. He twirled his fingers at me and produced the photo which had been in his other hand. What if there's someone there? I wouldn't be able to hear them. I took the photo from him and looked down at the address, which again appeared magically on the photo. It was in the same neighborhood as the axe-murdering Voodoo doll had been in. I doubt there'll be anyone left to worry about, he said with another hummed-out melody. Just as I was about to turn and exit the shop, loud banging began emanating from somewhere behind Creole. What the fuck? I said as my heart nearly exploded from the startlement. The look on Creole's face just further chills up and down my spine. I was so used to seeing that stupid smile on his face that seeing the scowl that crawled across his face as he turned his head toward the source of the banging nearly caused me to shit myself. Mace, be a doll and go out and do your task, please. I have some other business to attend to, he said as he produced his cane from thin air and began walking toward the back room. I thought he was going towards his office, but instead, he headed straight down towards what I figured was the basement. I wasn't about to be around to see whatever he was going to do, so I quickly shoved everything into my jacket pocket and exited the shop as quickly as I could. I was halfway down the street before I realized that I had left my house so quickly that I hadn't even bothered to bring my lockpick kit. Groaning, I made a U-turn and started jogging back toward my neighborhood. I got there just in time to see my dad leave for his next shift. I waved bye to him as he drove away and quickly entered my house. Mace, honey, my mom called out as I entered the house. She poked her head out of the kitchen and waved at me. She looked just as exhausted as my dad looked, since she had also had to start working for the first time since I was a toddler. Hey, Mom, I'm not back for long. I just forgot something, I said as I started up the stairs toward my room. Have you seen Jess lately? Her mom is worried sick about her. I froze at the entrance to my room as I heard my mom ask me this from downstairs. The memory of seeing Jess turned into a human puppet was still seared into my mind, her missing insides and that fucking smile that he had forced her to wear. No, not since we last hung out, I told her, not technically a lie. I quickly entered my room, swiped my lockpicks, and shoved them into my jacket pocket. Just as quickly, I made my way back downstairs to find my path to the front door, blocked by my mom. You sure you haven't seen her? She asked me, clearly not believing me. I could understand her suspicion since me and Jess had such a close friendship. No, Mom, I haven't seen her since we last hung out together, I reiterated. I don't really know what my face looked like at the time, but my mom was moved by whatever it looked like. She nodded and moved out of the way for me. Are you okay? She asked me. I wanted to tell her no, I wasn't. But just like with my dad, I had no idea where to even begin with that story. I wish I could have told them both. It would have made things so much easier in the long run. But I just wasn't able to do so. Yeah, Mom, I'm okay, I lied to her, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek and leaving the house. Out of the corner of my eyes as I turned to walk down the sidewalk, I saw her make the sign of the cross on herself and towards me. It made me feel a little better. But I wish that God could just strike me down right then and there instead. Walking toward the Target neighborhood again, it felt like something was watching me. The paranoia was getting to me as I flinched with every single noise that came my way. When I crossed the street towards the Target and a dog started barking at me, I thought that was it, and I was getting the K9. Instead, I was just faced with an especially cranky dog staring at me from behind a fence. Tossing him a stick to calm down, I quickly walked past him and toward my target. The house looked pretty much the same as the last house. Especially in a suburb like this one, pretty much every house looked the exact same. The main difference was the lock before me. It was another easy one for me, but this time there were two of them and there wasn't anything to hide me from plain view. No pants to hide me or anything out on their front lawn either. Creole just had to call me for this job in the middle of the afternoon. I looked around quickly and sure that no one was watching me quickly went to work. I knelt right before the door and tried to be as small and inconspicuous as I could possibly be. The locks were simple enough, but my sweaty palms and shaking hands kept the process slower than I would have liked. The sound of an approaching car nearly sent me into a panic attack. I quickly stood up and shoved myself up against the corner of the door. Lucky for me, it was a passing car and took no notice of me. Fuck. I sighed as I stood there like some lame Halloween decoration for a few seconds to get my heart to calm down. Going back to work, the second lock was quickly dispatched and the door opened. Putting my tools back in their pouch, I quickly dug into my jacket pockets and pulled out the earplugs. I smushed them into my ears, and with a few quick breaths, I entered the home. The first thing to strike me about this house was the amount of dust in the air. It was like this place had been abandoned for 40 years with the amount of dust up in the air. The next thing to strike me was the horrendous smell. It was like a strange mixture of citrus and pork, and it instantly sent my stomach into a revolt. It didn't make any sense. This house looked just as prim and proper as all the other houses. There was no way it was just left here to rot. Making my way through the entrance hall, I looked around for the clock, wishing that I could just take the earplugs out and follow the ticks it would be making. But remembering how Creole's advice and trinket had saved me from the axe-murdering voodoo doll, I quickly pushed my earplugs in deeper just to be sure. It didn't take me long to find the clock. It was prominently displayed in the large living room that the homeowners had. What was more shocking was the scene that I discovered in the living room itself. The source of the dust had been from there, and so was the smell. The smell, which I discovered, had been rot. Several people were present in the living room, though by the look of them, not a single one of them was alive. Those further away from the clock were slowly rotting away, their bodies bloated and putrefied. That was enough for me to throw up on the floor and sit there gagging for a few minutes as I desperately tried to cover my mouth and nostrils. As you went further toward the clock, the decomposition spread. Some were skeletons or fragments of skeletons, and closest to the clock was nothing but piles of dust and bone shards. All of the bodies had their arms stretched out towards the clock, as if there had been a mad dash towards it. I was left speechless. If it hadn't been so horrifying, it might have been strangely beautiful, like some weird Renaissance painting or something. The trouble for me now was twofold: getting to the clock and somehow sneaking it out of the neighborhood. It was decently sized, maybe about a foot tall and 2 feet across, and there was no hope of me just shoving it under my jacket and walking nonchalantly down the street with it. Thinking it over, I elected to wrap my jacket around it and carry it down the street as if I was just holding my jacket. Good enough, I shrugged as I took my jacket and took a few nervous steps toward the clock. I half expected to begin turning into dust along with however many people had been in this living room. But I figured that for it to have power over you, you had to hear it ticking. Stepping in the piles of dust and sending them airborne, I quickly held my breath to avoid breathing in the skeleton particles. I swiftly wrapped the clock up in my jacket and lifted it into my arms. I looked back behind me, expecting to see zombies or ghosts or fucking Bigfoot for all I knew. But the haunting scene remained the same. Seems as though it was a permanent fixture once you heard the clock. I didn't even want to fiddle with my earplugs, terrified that if I did, they would fall out of my ears and I would hear the clock's mechanisms. Without any more thought toward it, I quickly made my way toward the door and out into the neighborhood. I let out a long and cathartic sigh and quickly began to walk towards the voodoo shop. It was the longest walk of my life, and not just because I had a cursed clock with me. I was scared about what other horrible things King Creole would have me do. This was only his second favor, and the first one had nearly killed me. And this second one had me carrying this cursed clock out in the open. Arriving at the shop was like taking off your bra on an especially hot summer day. Quickly opening the shop, I saw Creole at the register, sewing one of his eyes back on. He turned the button in his hand towards me and smiled that stupid grin of his again. I was almost glad that I couldn't hear whatever bullshit he was saying. He motioned for me to bring the clock over and allowed his partially sewn-on button eye to dangle on his face. He was clearly more excited over the clock over the wound that he had received. I placed my jacket lump on the register and opened it up for him to look at. He was giddy with excitement and flicked the clock's face with his fingers. He then motioned for me that it was safe to remove my earplugs. I was worried he was tricking me, but remembering I still owed him 3 more favors, I removed the earplugs slowly and waited for my ears to adjust to the sudden influx of sound that had been denied to them. "Excellent work, Mace." Creole was giddy with excitement as he examined the clock. He did tisk with annoyance as the dangling button eye kept softly patting him on the cheek with every movement. He quickly placed it back against his eye socket and with impossible speed, quickly sewed it back on. That's much better. He sighed in contentment. What exactly is this clock, sir? I asked him, honestly and genuinely curious about it. I took a better look at it and realized that it was sort of in the shape of a crucifix. This is a monstrance clock, in more ways than one. He giggled, which got me to roll my eyes at his dumb pun. This particular clock has an aging curse on it. As long as it ticks, anyone who can hear it will die and begin to go through the process of decomposition. What stage you are depends on how far away you are from it. He was using his gloves to polish the clock, and I could tell he was very excited to have it. So, who were all the people in that living room? I asked him, pulling him away from his clock care routine. He stared at me for a moment with a blank expression before he seemed to process what I was saying. Some cult, I believe. They thought this clock would usher in the return of Christ or something. I guess in a way they did return to him. He made himself laugh uncontrollably at that. I groaned and turned my head towards the wall of voodoo dolls. They were all staring back at me, and I couldn't help but get the goosebumps from that. That was until I noticed two familiar-looking voodoo dolls on the wall. The dolls were exact matches to what Jeff and Tom had been wearing. Quickly snatching them from the wall, I placed them down on the counter next to the clock and stared at Creel as he continued to giggle to himself. "Let me buy them," I told him as I slid them closer to him. "No," he told me straight up. Any sentiment of laughter and happiness was gone from his voice. That southern drawl had gone from annoying to terrifying in an instant. He was being serious. Why not?" I demanded to know, reaching out for the Tom and Jeff voodoo dolls. But before I could grab them, they disappeared before my eyes. "Your credit's no good here, Macedonia." Creel's voice had grown hoarse, and he was clearly in no mood to listen to whatever I had to say to him. "Y'all are already in my debt, and I wouldn't want you going any further just to save your stupid friends. In fact, you should count yourself lucky that I don't place you on that wall with them, or have my fun with you like with Jess." He stood up and reached a hand out to me, gripping my shoulder tightly. "Go home and wait for me to call you again, because if you don't leave now, I might lose my temper." He shoved me slightly and I quickly got the message. I reached out and grabbed my jacket from the register and ran as fast as I could out of the shop. If Creole had eyes, there would have been murderous intent in them. As I walked home dejected, I began to think back on what had just happened. A few weeks ago, me and my friends were just breaking into abandoned places to steal some things and help our families through this hard time. Now, I was indebted to some evil voodoo corpse, and one of my friends was dead, while other two were turned into voodoo dolls. My life is fucked, and there's no other way to look at it. Maybe I should have gone to college after all. The time that elapsed between the next time King Creole called me was much less than the second time. He wasted only a day before calling me in the middle of a rare moment of spending time with my dad after he had finally gotten a day off. We had been holed up in the living room watching movies together when my phone began to vibrate in my pocket. "Son of a bitch," I grumbled as I saw who was calling me. I held up a finger to my dad when he was about to ask who it was before I answered the phone and quickly stood up from the couch. "Yes?" I didn't want to call him sir in front of my dad, since the last thing I wanted was to have him think that I had some kind of job on the side that he didn't know about. I had also expected Creole to be still pissed at me after trying to buy the Jeff and Tom voodoo dolls, but he still sounded as cheery as ever. "Mace, darling, sorry to interrupt your movie day with your dear old dad." Creole's voice laughed through the mic, making my blood cold when he mentioned my dad. I glanced over at my dad as he was barely paying attention to the movie and was starting to doze off on the couch. "Y'all can finish your movie if you'd like, but as soon as you're free, I need you here at the shop. Something's come up that requires your lovely picking skills. Don't take too long, darling." He chuckled before hanging up on me before I could even respond to him. I let out a pained groan into my hand as I shoved my phone back into my pocket. I walked back over to the couch and plopped myself down on it, not even stirring my dad, who had fully conked out. It wasn't even that I was upset at missing the movie, since it was one that me and Dad had watched plenty of times together. I was just annoyed and sad that I had to work on the one day he had a day off. With the movie finishing up not long after I shook my dad awake. With a snort, he shot up from the couch, probably thinking that he was late to work or something, before he reorientated himself to where he was. "Sorry, Daddy," I told him, smiling at the confused and tired look on his face. "I'm going out for a bit, okay?" I told him as I quickly checked my pocket to ensure that I had my lockpick tools with me this time. I'd rather not have a repeat of having to run back home for them. "Oh, okay, sweetheart," my dad said with a bit of relief. I figured he just wanted more sleep, so I guess it worked out for the both of us that Creole needed me for some other horrible job. I hugged him, and he made sure to give me one that succeeded in popping my back in several places. After he let me go, I went over to the front door and started making my way down to the Voodoo shop. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, which gave me some hope that this job would cause me less anxiety than the last two, but also scared me because it seemed like I was starting to get used to all this. The last thing that I wanted was to be getting used to this shit. I pushed all those thoughts to the back of my mind when I entered the shady part of town where the Voodoo shop was located. As I rounded the corner down the street from where the Voodoo shop was, my path was blocked by two guys I had known back in high school. "Mace?" Jacob, the taller of the two, asked as he turned to look at me when he realized that I was standing awkwardly there. I wasn't close to Jacob at school. He was known as the drug dealer and wannabe gang member. He had been expelled from the school just a few months before graduation and had apparently disappeared off the face of the earth. And of all the places I could have run into him, it had to be near the Voodoo shop. "Hey," I said, looking at the two guys before noticing the small Ziploc bag being passed between the two of them. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt your business." I cleared my throat as I tried to just walk past them. It wasn't any of my business what these two guys did with their free time and money. "She a cop or something?" the mystery dude said, and it was obvious that he was tweaking. Nothing about me screamed cop, but in this dude's mind, I must have been the biggest narc in the city. I was just going to walk past them and leave them be, but the druggie reached out and grabbed me. "Get the fuck off me!" I shouted at him as I kicked him as hard as I could in the crotch. When my life is on the line, fighting dirty is most definitely on the table. The junkie doubled over in pain and gagged with pain, with how hard I had driven my shoe into his crotch. Jacob backed up from me after I did that and didn't try to stop me from continuing on my way. I got only a few more steps forward before I felt a hand reach out and grab me. Before I could turn around to deal with whatever was grabbing me, I also felt a sharp and intense pain in my neck. "You fucking cunt!" The junkie coughed out as I felt the pain increase in intensity and warm liquid began seeping into my shirt. I looked down at my right side and cried out in gargled pain as I looked down at the knife sticking into my neck and being twisted around by the junkie. "You are a fucking cop, aren't you?" he screamed out as he pulled the knife out and stabbed it back into me. I tried to get away from him, but his grip increased on me, and I quickly felt my strength leaking out of me along with my blood. I could hear Jacob's voice, and he seemed to be distressed, but I couldn't tell what he was saying as the world began to spin and I felt increasingly lightheaded. And before I knew it, I had somehow ended up on the sidewalk floor. I could hear screaming and fighting just near me, but my eyelids grew increasingly impossible to keep open, and I struggled to be able to breathe. Just before I lost consciousness, I felt like I was being lifted off of the floor. I thought that maybe I would be going to heaven after all. When I next woke up, I was inside the Voodoo shop, inside King Creole's office. I was sitting down on a plush upholstered chair and felt like I had just been run over by a steamroller. When I tried to move even a muscle, I found it impossible to so much as move my pinky. "Goodness, you're awake already!" Creole's voice frightened me for a second, as the silence was suddenly broken by it. He walked past me and sat down on a small stool that was in front of the chair I was sitting on. I have to admit, he looked absolutely ridiculous sitting on that stool, and it made me smile. And if I could, I would have probably laughed. When I tried to open my mouth to speak, only a horrible croaking sound came out. And that scared me more than anything else. The feeling of hearing your voice in your head and not matching what comes out of your mouth is terrifying. "I wouldn't recommend talking at this moment, Mace, my darling," Creole told me as he was busy picking a few items off of his desk before swiveling on the stool back to face me. "That addict did quite a number on your throat." He had needle and thread in his hand, and I was apprehensive about letting him near me with those things. But it wasn't like I had much choice in the matter. So I allowed him to sew my neck up, and to my surprise, he finished almost as quickly as he started. My mama taught me how to sew real well. He chuckled as he produced a long pair of scissors to cut the thread. Now to help you recover your voice. He held up a small bottle filled with a deep blue liquid in it. Drink this in one gulp, he told me as he handed the small item to me. I nodded and uncapped it, letting the small cork drop to his floor. But he didn't seem to mind at all as I tipped my head back and allowed the viscous liquid to slide down my throat. It had no real taste at first, but as more time passed, it left a slight taste of citrus behind. How do I sound? I asked after a few seconds of letting the liquid settle. My voice had returned, but it sounded very far away, almost like the last hint of an echo. Creole nodded and carefully patted me on the head. It'll get stronger as time goes on. You're lucky I got to you in time. Any later and I don't think I would have been able to save you in this state. He sounded sincere for the first time since I'd had the displeasure of first meeting him. And yet even after being in his debt, he had still saved my life. What about them? I asked him, my voice still so quiet despite the fact I was trying to shout it out at him. Even Creole took a few moments to figure out what I was trying to say before that horrible smile I knew so well from him returned to his face. Well, that horrible addict has been dealt with, but I've not yet decided what to do with Jacob. He chuckled, standing up from the stool, walking back over to his desk and taking a seat behind it. While I was more than happy to hear that the person responsible for stabbing me had been dealt with, however horribly Creole may have done that. But in my mind, Jacob hadn't done anything wrong but try and get by just like I was. Is there a way for you to spare him? I don't feel like he deserves to be hurt, I said as I slowly felt my strength returning to my body. It was enough to be able to sit up in the big comfy chair he had sat me down in. This seemed to catch Creole off guard, and he stared at me with his giant button eyes for a moment. He hummed in thought for a moment. I suppose I can consider it. He shrugged his shoulders as he leaned back in his chair. But for now, you still have a job to do, darling, he said with a smile and stood up from his chair excitedly. I was about to complain to him, mostly about the fact I had almost been murdered a few minutes ago, but I didn't have any arguing points. What is it this time? I asked, startled at the slight increase in the volume of my voice. Creole kicked the stool out of the way and dangled a doll in front of me. It was a small puppet held up by strings, and I noticed that he didn't have one of those puppet controllers. The strings were coming out of his fingertips. A couple came in here with their child today, and while their backs were turned, the kid took a voodoo doll off the shelf. The little doll danced in front of me, and it took me longer than I should have probably realized that the doll resembled the junkie to a frightening degree. And you need me to get it back, I finished his statement, and he nodded excitedly. Is it in the same neighborhood as the last two? I asked, really just wanting to keep talking in the hope that by doing so, my voice would return faster. To my surprise, he shook his hand and turned his gaze down to the puppet. Suddenly, in the puppet's little hands was a drawing. This address should be more familiar to you, he said with that creepy, happy smile plastered on his face. I reached out and took the drawing from the puppet, and when I did that, the strings retracted into his fingertips, and he gripped the puppet tightly in his fist when it came up along with the strings. I shuddered at his sudden display of violence and looked down at the drawing, and to my shock, I was presented with an address that was in my neighborhood. I quickly looked back up at him, and he stared down at me, his size causing me to cower deep into the comfy chair. I had gotten used to the routine of going to some stranger's neighborhood. But this was in my crib, and there was a chance that I knew these people. It ain't going to be a problem, is it, my darling Mace? He reached out and held my face in his gloved hand. I shook my head quickly and stood up quickly. All my strength returned just to get me away from him. Something told me that a dick kick wouldn't do anything to him, so it was better just to get as much distance between us as possible. I'll get right on it, sir, I told him, stuffing the drawing, which I hadn't even paid attention to, into my pocket. Right on it, I repeated as I turned to leave his office. I walked past the basement door and was startled by the frantic banging that greeted me as I did so. I panted softly as I turned into the main shop and was again startled when I saw that Jacob was tied up with a gag stuffed into his mouth. He was sitting down in the register chair and he frantically screamed at me, though it was nothing but muffled nonsense. "Don't worry about him, Mace," Creole told me, as he suddenly appeared behind me and gripped my shoulder tightly. "I'll take good care of him." He laughed softly, a different tone from his normal cheery chuckles. This was a laugh that curdled my blood. Jacob's eyes were wide with fear as he stared at me, and he mumbled toward me. I shut my eyes as tightly as I could and simply ran toward the front door. I had my own problems to worry about. I couldn't be worrying about Jacob. In truth, I didn't want to end up like him, and maybe that's why I ran away so quickly and so blindly. I was already back in my neighborhood before I realized it and came back to reality. It only then occurred to me to check on the damage that had been done to me. I pulled my phone out and dared to point the selfie cam at my neck. I nearly burst out in tears at the sight of the gnarly stitching on my neck and throat. I quickly shoved my phone back into my pocket and did my best to pull my shirt up a bit to hide the horrible wound under it. Though it didn't do much but succeed in making me look more shifty, I pulled a drawing out of my pocket to double-check the address, and only then looked down at the voodoo doll I was being sent to retrieve. It looked smaller than the others in the drawing. Creole had made the effort to make it smaller in the picture, and it appeared to be a child wearing an outfit I'd describe as a 1950s aesthetic. I could only imagine what this poor kid was going to have unleashed on themselves. I sighed and hoped that I would get there before it was too late. I arrived at the home and was immediately glad that it wasn't someone I knew. And by the looks of it, the parents were still at work as no car was in sight, though there was the possibility of it being in the garage. What turned me off instantly, though, was the sight of a home defense advertisement on their front lawn, meaning I only had a certain amount of time before their alarm went off. I was about to whisper a curse when I suddenly felt my pocket get significantly hotter. I quickly reached into my pocket and pulled out the drawing. To my surprise, it was on fire, but only on one side, and that soon quickly ended. Smoke rose from the drawing, and I was greeted by both a message and a code. "Figured you might need this, Casey," the message said. That feeling of being watched returned to me, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I quickly reached into my pocket and pulled out my tools to get to work on this. The quicker this was over, the quicker I could ask him to somehow cover up this scar on my neck. I reached the door and quickly got to work. I hated to admit it, but the locks here in my neighborhood were nowhere near as good as the ones in the rich suburbs were. It was like picking a cheap padlock used on a bike, because before I knew it, the door was open, and I was quickly scrambling inside to input the code to deactivate the alarm. Once that was done, I quickly went about looking for the doll. If the kid had taken it, it was obvious to begin searching in their room. I walked past some family pictures and confirmed my thinking that the kid had been a girl. It would make sense for her to take a small doll that was seemingly made for little girls, like a horrible, haunted American Girl doll. As I started up the stairs, I started hearing giggling and laughing, not malicious or anything, the sounds of children playing. I arrived outside the girls' room and did my best to try and peek in without being noticed. Two girls were sitting on the bed and giggling with each other, and one of them was wearing the same outfit as the voodoo doll, which meant that I was too late, and I had no talisman to change the little girl back into a doll like I had done with the killer lumberjack. I had no idea what to do. Leaving the girls to play, I quickly went into the other room across the hall, which turned out to be a spare bedroom by the look of it. I silently closed the door behind me and quickly pulled my phone out to call Creole. The phone rang for an agonizing amount of time before he finally picked up. I wish he hadn't, because as soon as he did, loud screaming came pouring out of the mic. It soon quickly subsided into gargles that resembled the ones that I had made when I had been stabbed in the neck. "Mace, to what do I owe the pleasure of your call?" Creole asked me as he struggled against something on his end. I was quickly regretting this call, but if he wanted me to do something about this little girl, I needed him to give me something. "Sir, the voodoo doll has become a little girl, and I don't have a talisman to turn her back," I told him quickly, keeping my already quiet voice down, which was shockingly quiet. I swear to God, I must have sounded like a mouse to him. "Ah, well, that is unfortunate. I had hoped that you might be able to get to her before that happened. Lil Miss Sarah is quite the manipulator, especially with fellow children." He hummed into the receiver as he was thinking about something. I nervously tapped my foot on the carpeted floor and looked at the door separating me from the girls, and my eyes widened as I saw the door slowly close. "Sir, I think they might know I'm here," I whispered into my phone. There was silence on his end, and I looked down at my phone to see if he'd hung up on me. "Sir?" I asked with desperation in my voice. I started nervously pacing around the room waiting for him to answer me. "Get out of that house, Macedonia," he told me in a serious tone. He didn't have to tell me twice. I was already heading for the door to get out of the room and out into the hallway. I opened the door and started making my way toward the stairs. Just before I could reach the first step, I felt two pairs of small hands shove me down the stairs. My phone flew out of my hand as I came tumbling down to the first floor. The second time on one of these jobs, I'd fallen down a flight of stairs. "Great job, Em!" a small southern voice shouted out. I groaned and rolled over on my back, quickly met by someone sitting on my chest and holding a knife to my neck. This was quickly turning into the worst day ever, almost on par with when I first met King Creole. When my vision finally focused on the tiny figure straddling my chest, I saw that it was the living Voodoo doll girl. She was wearing a small 50s-style dress with brown hair tied in pigtails. She looked almost like Shirley Temple, although I don't think she was in any mood to give me animal crackers. What should we do now, Sarah?" a softer voice asked. Turning my head to the side, I saw standing behind us on the stairs was a little girl who also had pigtails. The voodoo doll, who was named Sarah, looked back at the little girl and then back down at me. A smile came across her face as she inched the knife close to my fresh stitches. "Call the police, Em. I'll keep her here," she ordered the other girl, who quickly scurried off to go and find a phone. I stared up at the little girl and could tell from the look on her face that she wasn't a normal little girl, if the fact that she was a living voodoo doll was any indication of that being the case. "You're going back to the store," I threatened her. She giggled and poked the tip of her knife into the gaps in the stitches of my neck. I shuddered and tried to remain perfectly still as she silently threatened me. "You're stupid if you think he's going to let you go after you complete his tasks," she told me. She may have been a little girl, but he had the mind of a deranged killer by the sound of her. I believed her, of course. It was something I thought about often. What was going to stop him from turning me into a voodoo doll or something worse? "What choice do I have?" I asked her, wishing so badly I could simply just shove her off of me. But with how her knife was held at my throat, one wrong move, and I wouldn't have Creole close by to save me a second time. The little girl looked down at me and then back up towards upstairs momentarily. "It's been almost 60 years and so much has changed. But I do know one thing." Sarah giggled maniacally as she looked back at me with a deranged look on her face. "I'm going to enjoy carving her like a pumpkin." She motioned toward the upstairs. I clenched my fist and without even thinking, decked the little girl in the face, sending her flying off of me. I acted quickly and started running toward the front door. I barely got a few feet before I was tackled to the floor. The one time the cops arrived on time, and it had to be the time that I was running from them. I kicked and tried to get them off of me, but I realized real quickly that that wasn't going to get me anywhere and simply went limp. My first thought was how my mom and dad were going to react to this. As I was shoved into the police cruiser, I glanced over to the front door where Sarah and Em were standing staring at me. And Sarah had her arm wrapped around Em and staring with a sadistic smile at me. When I arrived at the police station, I was quickly booked and tossed into an interrogation room. I quickly sat in the corner of the room and curled up in a ball in my chair. All I could think about was how my parents were going to react to this. They had tried so hard to prevent me from going down this path, and here I was under arrest and probably about to be thrown into jail. How exactly could I tell them that I was working for a living voodoo doll, tracking down his escaped voodoo doll children? I sighed as I fumbled around with the handcuffs that were on my wrist to pass the time. When the door to the interrogation room opened 3 hours later, I expected the stereotypical overweight cop to be interrogating me. Instead, I was met by a uniformed cop who looked like he'd just seen the most horrendous things that had ever happened. He fumbled around with his keys before unlocking my handcuffs and helping me stand up. "I'm so sorry. We had no idea of knowing that you worked for Mr. Creole. If you had told us that, we wouldn't have even brought you here." He was in an absolute panic. His words were going a million miles an hour, and it took me a few seconds to process everything. I rubbed my wrists, and he quickly exited the room and told me to follow him. The entire station was muttering to themselves as they saw me walk past them. "You guys know King Creole?" I asked the officer leading me toward the lobby of the station. He looked back at me and sighed as he held onto this bulletproof vest like every cop does. "We have an understanding with him. He keeps crime low. We stay out of his way," he told me in shame. My mouth dropped at that revelation. It all made sense. How the murders in the house with the lumberjack doll were never investigated. Why my missing friends weren't found. Why I was now suddenly being released without so much as a slap on the wrist. He had the police in his pocket. At the lobby of the station, I was met by a horrifying sight. I had expected Creole to be there to pick me up, but instead it was Jacob. Or rather, what had once been Jacob. His eyes had been replaced by buttons, and he was as pale as Creole was. It looked like he had been cut straight down the middle and was being held together by stitches and metal staples. His mouth, unlike Creole's, was sewn shut and tightly. He bowed down at me as if I was someone important or royalty. "I take it this freak is with you?" the officer escorting me asked, to which I nodded and shuddered in fear. I hadn't known Jacob very well, but to see someone I knew at all turned into one of Creole's playthings again like Jess had almost sent me into a full-blown panic attack. I was released into Jacob's company, and he opened the door for me to exit the station. And to my confusion and horror, we had somehow stepped out into the Voodoo shop. I looked back at Jacob as he followed me through the door and silently motioned for me to go to the register. I hesitated at first before following his instructions. He went in the back, probably to get his new boss, and left me standing before the counter. "Mace!" Creole shouted excitedly, his entire body drenched in blood. I shuddered and stepped back as he took his place at the register, picked up the template doll from the register, and began tossing it up and down in his hand. "Quite the mess you caused. You left me to clean it up," he teased me as he continued to toss the doll up and down. I'm sorry, sir," I apologized submissively, staring down at the floor like a child about to be scolded. It just all got out of hand. That could be used to explain my current situation or my entire life since first breaking into this hellhole. Apology accepted. "It felt nice to step out of the shop for once," he said as he stopped tossing the doll up and down and pointed with a blood-stained gloved finger toward the wall of voodoo dolls. I followed his gaze and saw that Sarah had been returned to voodoo doll form and was back on the wall, much higher up this time. Unfortunately, I didn't get there in time to save poor Miss Emily. He sighed sadly, his finger drifting down toward a doll just under Sarah. I covered my mouth in horror as I saw a doll that looked exactly like Emily under her. "What happened?" I asked him. He looked at me and held up his finger to his blood-stained face. "It's better you don't know," he hummed out. "Sarah was quite the little murderer back in the 50s. You wouldn't believe the amount of trouble I had getting her to walk into my shop," he said with a smile as he tossed the template doll back on the register and leaned in closer to me. "Even though you failed to get her back, I'll still count this as your favor done." He held up 2 fingers. 2 more to go. I nodded and reached up to pick at my stitches, just wanting some way to relieve the mounting stress and anxiety building up inside of me. "Do you have something to hide these?" I asked, pointing toward my wound. He looked at me and slapped the register table. I thought he was about to fly off the hinges and tear me apart or something, but instead he looked shocked. "Dear me, where is my head at? Of course, darling, one moment. Jacob, my boy?" He snapped his fingers toward the now mute Jacob. He went rigid like a soldier at attention, ready to receive whatever order his new boss had for him. "Go into my office and fetch the ointment for Lil Miss Macedonia here," he ordered, and Jacob dutifully nodded and walked back toward Creole's office. I was left alone with him as Jacob went to get my ointment. He stared at me with his button eyes for an uncomfortable amount of time. When the banging started up again from the basement door, I watched as his face contorted from his usual cheerily creepy smile to one of annoyance and rage. When Jacob finally returned with the ointment, it wasn't quick enough. I took it from him and was so happy that it came with instructions. I left the shop just as Creole stood up to go toward the basement. I applied the ointment as I walked along the sidewalk back toward my house. To my immense relief, I watched through my phone as the hideous scar and stitches disappeared before my eyes. I was left with a horrifying dilemma. When Creole was done with me, would he turn me into a voodoo doll or a mutilated living corpse like Jacob? The ointment that King Creole had given me was not permanent. Much to my shock and horror when I woke up and went to the bathroom, I saw the giant scar and stitches staring back at me. Turns out, the ointment lasts only 8 hours before it needs to be reapplied, which was annoying and forced me to have a timer go off just before 8 hours was up to reapply the ointment to my scar. Just another thing forced upon me because of my entanglement with King Creole. A week or two after my last job for him, I was rudely interrupted by him calling me again. I was in the middle of dinner with my mom. My dad was out at work on a late shift. I stared at my phone for a long time. Everything in me was telling me just to ignore him. It took everything in me to answer him and bring the phone up to my ear. "My darling Mace," Creole's excited voice greeted me, causing an annoyed exhale to come out of my nostrils. "Sorry to interrupt dinner with your lovely mother, but an urgent matter requires your attention. Finish your dinner and then get your lovely self down to the shop. See you then." He didn't even bother waiting for a response or let me respond at all. The call lasted probably all of 10 seconds. "Who was that?" my mom asked as he took a sip of her drink. I stuffed my phone into my pocket and picked at the chicken and rice staring back at me. My mom is a great cook, but it was hard for me to feel any kind of appetite when all I could think of was the horrible shit I had seen and had gone through. I had almost been murdered multiple times. One time being at death's door, and I had no one to turn to. Very hard to feel any kind of appetite after all that shit. "Scam call," I told her, and I forced myself to eat an entire forkful of food. She nodded and kept eating her share of the dinner. After I had eaten enough to pass for a normal amount of food, I pushed my chair back and carried my plate to the sink, rinsing it out after I placed my leftovers back into the pan that they had come from. "Mom, I'm going out for a walk. Do you need anything while I'm out?" I asked her once I had finished with my plate. "No, sweetheart, just be careful out there. Lots of weirdos out there nowadays," she said as she passed me with her empty plate. Oh, if only she knew the shit I was mixed up with. But I gave her a nod and a hug. I ran upstairs to my room to get my essentials. My lock-picking kit and now a new weapon to my arsenal, pepper spray. It might not exactly work on Creole, but it would stop a repeat of a knife ending up in my throat. As if to harp on that point, my timer went off, prompting me to go into the bathroom to quickly apply my ointment. It seemed that whenever it began to run low and I had to think about having to go back to the shop on my days off, the container would always refill itself. So I guess that was a nice plus. With everything ready for my next horrible errand, I hugged and kissed my mom goodbye before leaving my house and heading in the direction of the Voodoo store. Despite it clearly being labeled half-priced Voodoo store, my mind constantly wanted to call it a voodoo shop. Something about it just rolled off the tongue better. Maybe Creole had a branding issue or something. The sun was just about to dip below the horizon and the streetlight flickered to life, creepily illuminating my way towards the shitty part of town where the store was located. This time, thankfully, I didn't run into any drug dealers or crackheads. But my hands never left my pockets the entire time. I had my finger on the trigger of the pepper spray, ready for anyone that might want to jump me. But I arrived safely at the store and opened the door, the sad, rusty bell signaling my arrival. Waiting for me at the register was Jacob. It hadn't gotten any easier to look at him. He was in a new outfit, however. Before he had been in a suit similar to King Creole's, but now he was wearing a bellboy outfit. It was bright red with shiny gold trimmings. He looked like some sort of ornamental nutcracker or something, with how new and shiny he looked. His stitched-up mouth was now curled up into a smile as he eagerly waved hello to me. "Doesn't he just look positively lovely?" Creole shouted excitedly, causing me to yelp in surprise as he suddenly appeared behind me. He wrapped his arm around me and led me closer to the register. Jacob took his hat off and did a little bow to me, and I awkwardly waved hello to him, more worried about getting Creole off of me. "He looks good," I said, shrugging his arm off of me and letting out a sigh of relief when he finally let me go. If he was offended by my shrugging his affection off, He didn't let it dampen his excitement over how Jacob looked. Doesn't he? I wanted to try something new with him, and I'm absolutely adoring how he turned out, he shouted with giddy excitement. Jacob placed his little hat back on before bowing again and excusing himself to the back room. He left us alone, and I suddenly found the atmosphere much less inviting without him there. "So, how's business?" I asked him, trying to cut some of the awkward tension in the room. He craned his neck down to look at me. I could swear that his head was about to break its stitches and his head would go tumbling to the floor with how he was staring at me. "It's great. Can't complain about it at all, actually." Creole let out a big chuckle before slapping me on the back hard and heading behind the counter as if to escape any imaginary retaliation I might want to do to him. "Don't worry, Mace. I won't let you kill yourself with small talk," he said as he sat down in the chair that sat behind the register. "I need you to get me a mirror. A very special one." His smile dipped a bit. This was something serious. "What does it do?" "I assume since you want it, it probably isn't normal." I walked up to the counter and noticed that the Voodoo template doll was staring back at me. "You catch on quickly." Creole snickered at me in a patronizing tone. "It's best if I don't tell you what it does. In fact, for your own safety, I'd advise you not even to glance at this mirror." He raised his arm and fluttered his fingers, a scrap of paper appearing between his index and middle finger. "This place is also quite far away, and I know y'all aren't going to make it walking. So I'll give you some help," he said as he handed me the scrap of paper. I took it from him and looked down at it. It was only what I guessed was a room number. "Where exactly is this?" I asked, looking back up toward the register, only to find him not there anymore. I quickly spun on my heels to see if he was behind me, and sure enough, the tall bastard had somehow teleported over to the entrance to his shop. "An abandoned hotel in Pennsylvania. Quite the walk for you, I know," he said with that stupid smile on his face. That was at least a several-day nonstop walk, and there was no way I was making it there without my parents noticing. "How exactly am I to get to Pennsylvania?" I asked him, stuffing the room number into my pocket. He giggled a bit as he motioned for me to come closer. I took a few steps over to him and watched as he again fluttered his fingers. Soft purple flames emanated from his fingertips. He proceeded to draw on the door, and I watched with a hint of wonderment as it subtly gleamed purple and then died down into nothingness. "It's just a simple step away, darling." He opened the door for me, and I was more than a little surprised to see that the door didn't open to the outside. It opened to the lobby of a hotel. I quickly walked over and stuck my head through the door. The other side was an almost pitch-black hotel room with dust and cobwebs floating through the air. "You might want this also," he said as he handed me an electric lantern. I nodded and grabbed it from him. I took a deep breath and entered the hotel. "Remember, don't look at the mirror," he warned me before shutting the door behind me. I stared back at the door and stayed in place for a few seconds in the pitch blackness. It took me a few seconds to figure out how to turn the lantern on, but when I at last illuminated the lobby, I was more than happy. Not a single sound was being made in the hotel. Not a creak in the floorboards, no wind blowing from outside, not even the sounds of rats scampering around. It was absolute silence. The only sound I could hear was my breathing. If it wasn't for the lamp, I might have thought I was in a sensory deprivation chamber. I fished the room number out of the pocket and stared down at it with the lantern. Room 1145. There were at least 11 floors to this hotel, and I knew for damn sure that even if this place had an elevator, there was no chance of it working. I walked over to the front desk and stared down at it. There was a bell there to ring for staff, but something in my gut was telling me that it would be a terrible idea to ring it. So I simply moved on and headed towards the stairs, following the signs that pointed me the way. While this place was abandoned, it also seemed to be frozen in time. As I walked past the kitchen and dining area, I was shocked to see food out and ready to be served. Breakfast foods were piled high and ready to be eaten. The coffee was warm, the milk was cold, and the fruit was fresh and ripe. It was like this place had been abandoned and left in limbo. "This place is weird," I mumbled to myself as I continued to walk toward the stairs. I opened the door that led to the stairwell and was immediately blasted with the overwhelming smell of rot. It was enough to cause me to drop the lantern and let out a retch that echoed throughout the entire hotel. I quickly picked the lantern back up and ran back toward the kitchen. I grabbed a cup of coffee and quickly took a giant inhale of it just to get something else into my nostrils. Fuck, was all I could reasonably think of saying. Before I could even think about going back toward that stairwell again, I quickly picked up some giant napkins from one of the tables, the kind that you usually put on your lap, and wrapped them around my mouth and nose in a makeshift face mask, making sure to dampen it with coffee to give me at least something else just as strong to counteract the smell. With my makeshift mask ready, I once again braved the stairwell. It didn't take me long to find the culprit of the noxious smell. A pile of decomposed bodies was lying at the foot of the stairs. I couldn't even begin to count how many of them were there, as their limbs were all tangled together. I shoved my mask as close as I could to my nostrils and did my best to focus only on the coffee smell. Time may have stopped for food in this hotel, but dead bodies sure as hell still decomposed just fine. I was forced to step on them since there was no other way to begin climbing up the stairs. The sickening crunch and snapping of bones were enough to get another retch out of me as I desperately tried to focus on the smell of coffee. I moved as quickly as I could towards the stairs and began running up them as fast as possible. I didn't dare take off my mask until I reached the 11th floor. Opening the door to the floor, I quickly ran into the hallway and shut the door behind me. I took my mask off to see if I could breathe easier and was relieved to be away from the horrible smell of death. I was never more grateful for the smell of something normal. I stood there catching my breath after running up 11 flights of stairs and took a look around, moving the lantern up and down to see if anything else was up here with me. The halls were empty, but every single door on this floor had a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the doorknob. After my breath was sufficiently caught, I started making my toward room 1145. The eerie silence was enough to start playing tricks on me. Every single step I took, it felt like something was following close behind me. I would stop and shine the lantern behind me, but there was nothing there. But every time I started walking again, I swear I could hear a second set of footsteps just after mine. When I arrived at room 1145, I was happy to see that the door was an old one. It didn't have the electronic locks that hotels have now. This one needed a key, and that's why I had been sent here. I sat the lantern down next to me and got my tools out, ready to work on his lock. I was surprised by how this lock acted. It was almost like the lock Creole used for the Voodoo shop. The tumbler seemed to be changing constantly, and every time it felt like I was close to getting somewhere, all my progress was erased. Son of a bitch, I mumbled as I fiddled with the lock. I wasn't about to let some ancient, probably magic-infused lock show me up. So with way more brute force than skill, I started attacking this lock with everything I had learned. And to my immense satisfaction, I heard the satisfying click of the door unlocking. I quickly turned the doorknob, pushed the door open, and clapped with joy over how I had finally gotten through the lock. I quickly packed up my tools in their bag and stuffed them into my pocket. I made sure to look down at the floor just in case this freaky mirror was just standing there waiting for me to stare at it. I decided to use my makeshift face mask as a blindfold. I wrapped it around my head and reached my arms out to feel out in front of me. I left the lantern in the hallway since I was going in completely blind anyway. I patted my hands out in the darkness to begin building up my surroundings. It wasn't easy, and I bumped into pretty much anything and everything I came across. Finally, after a few minutes of bumping into things, I got a general layout of the room, but I hadn't figured out where the mirror was. It was then that it hit me. What size was this mirror? Creole hadn't said if it was a body mirror or a handheld mirror or the fucking bathroom mirror. Exiting back into the hallway, I took off my blindfold and tried to think of a better way of doing this. I looked back into the darkness of the room and then down at the lantern. I picked up the lantern and then tossed it into the room. Immediately, I could tell that there was no mirror right at the entrance, so I would be okay to enter at least there with some light. I walked in with the lantern and looked around where the light touched. With that crossed off, I picked up the lantern and looked around for something to cover up a side of it. Lucky for me, there were towels just hanging on the coat hanger on the door to the bathroom. I covered one side of the lantern so that light could only appear on one side. I then extended my arm out into the main room of the hotel and slowly began to rotate the lantern as if it were some sort of makeshift lighthouse. My thinking was that if it came into contact with a mirror, then the light would be reflected onto the wall, not illuminated by the lantern, since that side would be covered by the towel. And to my amusement, I was proven right when after a few turns the light appeared on the other wall. Bingo! I giggled as I quickly pulled the lantern back and placed it back on the floor. Then I tied my blindfold back on and quickly went out in the direction in which I had pointed my light. After a few seconds of groping in the darkness, my fingers came into contact with the cold and slick surface of a mirror. I must have been smiling a big stupid grin when I reached it. I felt the mirror up a bit and figured that it was some sort of standing mirror. I tried lifting it and found it relatively light. Confident in my abilities, I started walking towards the door. Of course, in my excitement over finding the mirror, I happened to have forgotten where I had placed the lantern. I tripped over it and fell with the mirror down onto the floor. I groaned in pain and surprise, feeling like a dumbass over how I had forgotten the lantern. And when I looked up from the floor, I was shocked to see my reflection looking back at me. The fall had pulled down my blindfold. Shit! I quickly sat up and grabbed the lantern. I half expected that I would explode or spontaneously combust or turn to dust, but after a few seconds, nothing happened to me. I closed my eyes and reached out to the mirror and sat it up completely. The first time had been an accident, but the second time curiosity at last got to me, and I opened my eyes to look at the mirror. It was just my reflection. Nothing horrible about it, just me. I moved my arm around and did a few moves, and it followed it perfectly. It seemed like a normal mirror. Had I gotten the wrong one? That train of thought was quickly derailed when I saw that my reflection was smiling at me, when I for sure wasn't smiling. I backed up from the mirror, and yet my reflection didn't follow what I was doing. It just stared at me with a look of total malice in its eyes. I watched with complete and utter terror as it began to contort and change. My limbs grew gangly. It looked like some sick funhouse mirror version of me. Her nails grew longer until they had completely turned into claws, and my small stature was completely erased into some horrible stretched out version of myself. It would have been scary enough if that was all it did. But then she started crawling out of the mirror. "Oh, fuck this!" I screamed as I quickly turned around and started sprinting towards the stairs. I probably haven't run that fast since I was forced to run a mile in PE. My gym teacher probably would have loved the form I was using. It was probably textbook. I reached the stairs in no time flat, only to discover that it was locked. "You gotta be fucking kidding!" I screamed and began fighting with the lock. I looked back down the hall and screamed in absolute terror when I saw my reflection chasing after me on all fours like some skinwalker-looking thing. Her creepy smile was accompanied by some new sharp and jagged teeth that were no doubt ready to tear me to shreds. She didn't even bother saying words to me, only cackling uncontrollably as she quickly closed the distance between us. I wasted no more time on the locked door and sprinted down the hallway to my right, and was more than happy to see a fire escape warning above the door at the end of the hall. As I was sprinting down the hall, though, I could hear that my reflection was rapidly catching up with me, and I could feel that if I ran toward that door, there'd be no way for me to make it there in time. I was about to look behind me when I noticed one of the hotel rooms was open. In a split second, I changed directions and ran into the room, quickly slamming the door shut behind me, locking and deadbolting the door. My reflection came slamming into the door, but the thick wooden structure withstood her attack for the time being. I lay on the floor catching my breath for a moment before I started looking around either for escape or for some sort of defense. I fished in my pocket for my pepper spray and got it out. I didn't exactly know if my reflection would be affected by it, but having it with me gave me a little sense of safety. I was also glad that through my blind panic, I had somehow managed to keep the lantern with me. Any sense of safety was quickly erased when my reflection began banging on the door again, and I noticed cracks beginning to appear on the door. I couldn't waste any more time. I looked around and tried to find something or anything to get me out of this situation. I thought about calling Creole, but when I pulled my phone out, I was met with the dreaded no signal. With that idea expended, I looked around the room and discovered it was one of those rooms that was separated by another with a door. If I could pick the lock, I could sneak into the other room and maybe make it to the fire escape. Quickly pulling my tools out, I didn't bother wasting a second and began trying to figure out which tool would do the best job. All the while, my reflection was screaming an otherworldly scream and smashing herself against the door. To my immense relief, this lock didn't seem to have any magic fuckery infused into it. And in no time flat, I had picked the lock and had managed to enter the other room. I dimmed the lantern and quietly closed the dividing door behind me. I waited in the dimly lit room until I heard the sounds of the door being broken down and my reflection entering the room. I was waiting at the door, and the moment I heard her enter the other room, I slowly opened the door and exited into the hallway. I could hear her tearing the room apart looking for me, and I started making my way toward the fire exit, as quietly and as quickly as I could. I was about 10 feet away from it when I heard her scream. I looked behind me and saw that she had exited the room and had seen me. I sprinted toward the door and flung it open. I half expected to be put outside, but instead I came tumbling into the Voodoo store. I was never more happy to see the dust-filled shop in my entire life. The fire exit had been linked to the front door of the Voodoo shop, and I had ended up smashing into one of the shelves of shrunken heads. Mace? Goodness, darling? You in some kind of rush? Creole asked as I heard his footsteps and cane rapidly approaching me. Before I could even look at him, though, I looked back at the door and reached out towards it. Quick, shut it! That was all I got out as my reflection came sprinting towards me. She leapt through the door and was about to lunge toward me when Creole swung his cane like a baseball bat and sent her flying into the glass window of the shop. The hit must have knocked her unconscious as she went limp after she hit the floor. I see you looked at the mirror, Creole said in clear disappointment. I stared up at him and then over toward my corrupted reflection. I quickly put him between me and her and did my best to try and explain how it had all happened. I must have been talking 1,000,000 miles an hour, and yet Creole seemed to understand everything completely. I see, so it was an accident, he said after I was done and catching my breath. Yes, sir. I nodded, jumping a bit when Jacob suddenly appeared next to Al with a glass of tea. I'm not normally a tea drinker, but after what I had just gone through, I gladly accepted it from him and took a big sip of it. Well, there's no harm in a simple mistake. Though why didn't you just put a blanket over the mirror once you found it? Creole asked me as he walked over to my reflection and poked her with his cane. I nearly choked on my tea when he asked me that. The thought had never even crossed my mind, and it was such a good idea. I didn't think of that, I admitted to him, embarrassed over having not thought of that. What had my plan even been? Walk down the stairs blindfolded, holding a giant mirror? I felt like a dumbass. Don't worry about it, Mace. Just go and bring the mirror back here. I'll deal with our long friend here, Creole said as he rubbed his gloved hands together with giddy excitement. I nodded quickly and handed the nearly empty cup of tea over to Jacob before entering the hotel again through the Voodoo shop's entrance. When I rounded the turn to where I had left the mirror standing in the hallway, I quickly shut my eyes as tightly as I could and began walking towards it, arms stretched out in an attempt to find it. I finally touched it and picked it up, carefully walking with it until I was back in the Voodoo shop. I felt it being taken from me and figured it was Jacob taking it out of my hands. You can open your eyes now, Mace, Creole greeted me with a chuckle after I had stood there with my eyes shut for a few minutes. When I opened them, I saw that the mirror was covered by a thick white sheet and that Jacob was carrying it over to Creole's office. Where's my reflection? I asked, seeing that she was no longer crumpled in the corner. Oh, while you were getting the mirror, I tossed her back into the hotel. She shouldn't be too much of a bother. Creole let out one of his strange hums at this and beckoned me to follow him back to the register. That's 4 favors done, and only one last one to do until you've cleared your debt with me. Creole sat down and held up a single finger to me. Sir, what is that mirror even for? Why would you want something like that? I asked him, really not caring at the moment that I had only one favor left to do for him. Call it an insurance policy, my darling Mace, he said with a grin on his face. If I ever need a way to come back, why not come back as a nightmare? He asked me with a series of low and creepy laughs. He shooed me away as he began cackling, and I was more than happy to leave him in a laughing fit. After everything I had just gone through, I wanted nothing more than to collapse into my bed and rot away. One favor left. That's all I had to do. then I would be free. If only it had been that simple. Creole dangled that final favor over my head for a few weeks. He didn't summon me or even contact me as if he was dragging out my final task until he truly felt like doing so. While it annoyed me, I eventually found it to be a blessing. It allowed me to process everything that had happened to me and recharge my batteries. I also did my best to avoid mirrors after my hotel ordeal with my corrupted reflection. Every time I even passed a mirror, it felt like at any moment she burst through the mirror and ripped me into pieces. After almost 3 weeks of silence from Creole, I was sitting home alone, having agreed to help my parents fill out their taxes while they continued to work themselves to the bone. I didn't exactly know what I was doing, but I figured that no one ever really knows what they're doing when they fill out a tax form. I was in the process of chewing the end of my eraser when our doorbell rang. Now I'm usually the type of person who never answers the door when the doorbell rings. If I don't know that you're coming over beforehand, then I ain't answering the door. But something about this doorbell felt different. And after all, I wasn't getting anywhere with my parents' tax forms, other than the feeling of dread with how badly we were faring, even with both of them working 2 jobs. So I stood up from the kitchen table and made my way over to the door. "Jacob?" I asked with surprise and a bit of shock when I saw the bellboy standing at my door. He waved to me happily and then reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to me. I took it from him and was greeted by the familiar handwriting that Creole's notes carried. "Why didn't he just call me?" I asked Jacob, forgetting that Creole's bellboy was now a mute. He simply pointed at the envelope. I looked down at it, opened it, and began to read. "Mace, so sorry that I'm not able to call you. I'm currently out of town on a business trip, but this is the perfect opportunity for your final favor. Jacob is here to lead you to the shop where I've left further instructions. And don't worry about anyone seeing y'all. Not like anyone will believe you if you told them. Best regards, KC." That last sentence felt like a threat. It was something that existed constantly in the back of my mind, especially after I found out that Creole had the police in his pocket. It was best to just grit my teeth, get this final favor done, and never have to think of old King Creole's half-priced voodoo store ever again. "Just give me a minute to get my things," I told Jacob. He nodded quickly and gave me a thumbs up. He was such a different person now that it was scary. I hadn't known Jacob well in high school, but seeing him like this caused me to feel sorry for him. He certainly didn't deserve this. It wasn't his fault that I had gotten stabbed by one of his customers. And yet it was my fault that he was now a servant of the same monster that held my own life in his gloved hands. I allowed Jacob into the house while I headed upstairs, followed by the thoughts that filled me with guilt over what had happened to him. I applied more of Creole's ointment so that my scar and stitches would continue to be hidden. I gathered my lock-picking tools and my pepper spray, and finally joined Jacob downstairs. He was busy looking at the pictures hung up on my wall, and when he noticed me, he quickly spun on his heels and gave me a salute, a cheery smile on his stitched-up mouth. "Let's just get this over with," I told him, barely able to stand his overly cheery demeanor. He nodded and followed me outside. I locked the door and followed him as he led me toward the voodoo store. As I followed Jacob, I took the letter he had given me and started reading it again. Something was bothering me. "Where the hell does he need to go to be on a business trip?" I asked Jacob, again as if the mute bellboy could answer me. He shrugged his shoulders as he continued down the sidewalk. I looked back down at the letter and suddenly got a terrible feeling about something. Were there other freaks like Creole? If one freak exists, it only makes sense that others also exist. This horrible line of thought was abruptly halted when I walked into Jacob. I was about to get pissed at him, but then I realized that we'd arrived at the voodoo shop. "Oh," I said, my cheeks getting warm with embarrassment. I had been so absorbed in my thoughts that we'd arrived in record time. Jacob just smiled and opened the door for me. I mouthed a quick thanks and entered the shop, hoping to leave my embarrassment outside. Every voodoo doll quickly turned to look at me as soon as I entered. I quickly held my hands up to show them that it was me, and Jacob entering the store behind me put them all at ease. I guessed that they were some sort of security system for when their boss was away. Jacob led me to Creole's office, and as we passed the basement door, whatever was down there quickly began pounding at the door. It surprised me so badly that I screamed and quickly rushed past Jacob toward the office, putting as much distance as I could from the creature in the basement. I entered Creole's office and quickly sat myself down on the comfy chair where I had received my life-saving surgery from Creole. Jacob followed after me and closed the door behind us. He went behind Creole's desk and began searching for something. I, meanwhile, finally took full notice of Creole's office. Since the last time I had been there, I had been on death's door. His office was filled with photos, with a grand majority of them being scratched out in some way, all except one on his desk. I reached out and grabbed the picture frame to look at it. It was an old black and white photo of a man and a woman. Is that? I held the photo closer to my eyes to examine it. The man was tall, with messy black hair. Creole? I whispered to myself as the figure in the picture was a dead ringer for Creole. Of course, minus the button eyes and stitches across his mouth and neck. Just as I was about to examine the woman, the photo was suddenly snatched from my hands. I just about had a heart attack thinking that Creole had somehow returned and taken it from me. But it was only Jacob with more of my directions. Right, sorry, I told him as I accepted the couple of pieces of paper he handed to me. There were Creole's usual doodles of what I had to retrieve, though these were the strangest ones yet. Though thinking back now, it certainly seemed hard to top a clock that caused you to decay and a mirror that creates a horror version of yourself. Creole wanted me to steal some sort of file and a porcelain doll. The porcelain doll made sense. The wall of voodoo dolls was enough to prove Creole's obsession with dolls. But the file was what interested me more. What exactly did he want that for? Was it some sort of haunted file or something? I looked at the next page, which was another letter. Why he couldn't have just told me everything in the first letter was lost to me. Mace, by now Jacob should have given you the target of my current desire. After you've finished reading this and are ready to begin your final favor, he'll take you to your target, and I'm sure you're dying to know where it is. It's in a lovely Massachusetts mansion. The owner rarely ever goes there anymore, so it should be a walk in the park for you. Just this last favor and you can finally go free. He didn't bother signing this one, but I could care less. The third paper appeared to be completely blank, so I just shoved that into my pocket with everything else. Well, I guess I'm ready, I told Jacob as I stood up. He nodded and reached into his pocket. He rummaged around in there for a moment before he pulled out a key. The bow of it was a skull, which probably meant that it was a skeleton key of some sort. I'm sure Creole had gotten a kick out of it for that reason. The bellboy inserted the key into Creole's office door and turned it. Before my eyes and Jacob's buttons, the door began to morph and change into a much more ornate and fancier one. The golden initials CS were stamped onto each door, and Jacob swung the door open for me. Wish me luck, I said as he handed the key to me. I assumed so I could make a quick escape if the situation called for it. He held a thumbs up and waved goodbye to me as I stepped through the doors. I had to blink my eyes furiously after entering the mansion as I was blasted with natural lighting that blinded me when compared to the dimly lit voodoo shop. This place was massive, from a giant chandelier above my head to massive windows that let in plenty of sunlight into the mansion. But even despite its grandeur, it felt cold, both in temperature and in feeling. It was the beginning of fall, but even so, there wasn't any reason for it to be this cold enough to see my breath. I shivered as I took my few steps forward into the mansion. Right at the entrance, next to the grand staircase, was a giant family portrait of who I at first assumed were the owners of this massive palace. But judging by the clothes the woman was wearing and the style of suit the older man was wearing, I quickly judged that they must be some kind of ancestors. The woman and man both had their hands on the boy in front of them. The mother and I assumed her son both had blonde hair, while the father had thick brown hair with a giant mustache. Where would this file be? I wondered to myself after a moment of staring at the giant portrait. I reached into my pocket to try and find something in Creole's notes, and to my surprise, the previously blank sheet of paper had suddenly transformed into a map of the mansion. To my surprise, the file wasn't located upstairs, but in a downstairs office. Armed with this knowledge, I started making my way towards it, checking the map every so often so that I wouldn't become lost in the maze of hallways and rooms that this mansion possessed. The cold started getting to me as I shivered uncontrollably and vapors of breath poured from my mouth. The quicker I got this over with, the better. not only as my final favor, but because I wasn't about to have myself catch a cold over this. Finally, I made it to the correct door. I tried to turn the knob and found it locked. I half expected this to just be a snatch and go, but I suppose that there was a reason Creole sent me. Getting on my knees and warming up my hands with my breath, I quickly went about trying to pick this lock. What immediately struck me was how old this lock was. Not like rusty and about to fall apart old, but in design old. I'd never come across a lock like this, and I had to figure out how to actually go about picking it. My shaking hands and body also added to my struggles, and I dropped my tools on more than one occasion. Finally, after 10 minutes of fumbling, cursing, and giving up once, I finally managed to open the door. "Let's fucking go!" I shouted in excitement, covering my mouth quickly as my voice echoed throughout the mansion. I quickly entered the room and closed the door behind me. I was surprised to see that it wasn't an office, but more like a storage room with a few boxes and filing cabinets. He really wasn't going to make this easy on me, was he? I opened a few of the filing cabinets and found many of them empty, which sped up the process of finding the file I needed. It was the second to last one that finally yielded results. The only problem was that this cabinet was full of files. Just as I was about to try and steal all of them, one of them caught my eye. I was flipping through them and cursing Creole with every file that I flicked past when one felt different from the others. Mostly because it had a paperclip attached to it in a photo. I pulled this file out and looked down at it. The picture was of a woman who looked exactly like the woman at the entrance of the mansion. Opening it, I read through it a little. Abigail A. Sinclair fell into deep and uncontrollable hysteria after the death of her husband, Cornelius A. Sinclair, and the return of her son from the war. Her son has seen fit to place her under the care of the Boston Psychopathic Hospital. Her son has requested that he not be informed of her progress or if she passes away in our care. "Geez," I said as I flipped through more of the file. The most striking were two photos. One was of Abigail when she was mentally well, and the next was her locked in a straitjacket and completely a shell of her former elegant self. Her hair was wild and her face was twisted into a look of intense fear and sorrow. I reached into my pocket to consult my magic pages and found that the map had now turned into a simple phrase. "That one," was all it said now. I looked back down at the file and stared at the haunting eyes of Abigail. I felt horrible for her, and I could only wonder what Creole wanted this for, but it was better for me not to think about that. I closed the file and tucked it under my armpit. The paper now changed back to a map and was leading me back towards the main entrance. Walking down the hallways was quicker now that I had an idea of where I was going, and I was back at the main entrance in no time. The paper now told me to head up the grand staircase upstairs into one of the bedrooms. I assumed to Abigail's room, since judging by her file in the massive portrait, she didn't have a daughter. So I started making my way up the stairs, each of my footsteps echoing throughout the halls. At the top of the stairs, I was greeted by a different portrait, one of a tired-looking man in a suit. He had deep bags under his eyes and perfectly combed blonde hair. "This must be the son," I said as I approached the portrait. His scowl was enough to send a chill up my spine. It felt like his angry hazel eyes were staring deep into my soul. I shivered hard and quickly moved past the portrait. I reached Abigail's room and was happy to see that it was open. The room was pristine and perfect in every way. It felt like it had been deliberately kept this way, and I was intruding on a museum piece. There, sitting on the bed, was the doll, a small little porcelain one. I was going to have to be careful lest I end up accidentally dropping and shattering it. I walked to the bed and carefully picked her up. All I had to do now was make it back to the office, and I would never have to deal with shit like this ever again. I exited the bedroom and headed towards the stairs, passing the portrait of the son. Just as I did, I was suddenly and violently grabbed by the throat. In my surprise and shock at being suddenly attacked, I dropped everything I was holding to grip the mystery hand that was choking me. I watched in terror as the porcelain doll began to fall to the floor. Instead of shattering into a million pieces, though it was caught in midair by something. "May I ask what you're doing here?" a deep voice asked me. I looked up toward the portrait and stared at it as it seemed to come to life. The son stepped right out of the portrait and continued his death hold on me while the doll floated up next to him. I don't exactly know how he expected me to answer him, but he gave me an opportunity after he dropped me to the floor. Whoop! I gasped as I tried to suck in air only to be met with a skeletal, goopy form staring at me from the floor. I let out a croak that was supposed to be a scream before falling backward and almost falling down the giant staircase. "That freak sent you here, didn't he?" the man asked as he looked down at me on the floor. The strange, goopy creature slithered around him like some kind of snake before perching itself on his shoulder and letting out strange gurgles from its bright white mouth. Two beady white eyes stared down at me, along with the exhausted eyes of the man who had just stepped out of a painting. "Creole?" I asked him, standing up and reaching into my pocket, rubbing my thumb across my pepper spray. I didn't know if it would do anything to him, but I needed some sort of protection, and this was all I had in that department. "Yes, that bastard," he said as he took the file from the creature as it lifted it towards him. He took it, and the moment his eyes saw the picture of his mother, I could tell he wanted to kill me right there. "Why the fuck would he want this?" he asked me, his creature slithering over to me and opening its giant white maw. I don't know. He just told me to get these things," I told the son, quickly holding my hand up and uncapping my pepper spray. The creature stopped just before it could eat me, and then quickly slithered back over to its master. I lowered my hand and watched as the creature morphed into the shape of his shadow, sending a woman to do his dirty work. I knew he was pathetic, but not this pathetic, he hissed, and I could immediately tell that he saw me as less than a parasite. His tired eyes were burning with rage as stared at me. I figured he was trying to figure out what to do to me, and I wasn't going to let him think that over. I pulled my pepper spray out and quickly sprayed him with it. That caught him off guard, and he let out a pained shout, quickly covering his eyes with his arm. That summoned his creature back from his shadow. In fact, as I saw him emerge once again, it was obvious that the thing was his shadow. I had gotten the spray's fumes in my own eyes, and they began to sting and tears started streaming from them. I took this opportunity to sprint down the stairs. It's some miracle that I didn't fall and break my shit. I made it to the main entrance and quickly fished in my pocket for the skeleton key. I shoved it into the keyhole and turned it. I watched and waited for the door to finish morphing, and when it did, I flung the door open and slammed it shut behind me. I panted and sniffled, as now my nose began to run uncontrollably along with the tears in my eyes. I felt a pair of hands hold my face up, and suddenly cold water being poured onto my face. "Jacob?" I asked as the pain and tears began to subside. His pale, smiling face was more comforting to me than anything else could have been. I shoved my face into his bright red uniform and hugged him tightly. The floodgates opened. I don't know if it was from the pepper spray or my latest near-death experience, but I began to cry uncontrollably into Jacob's chest. He wrapped his arms around me and gave me a soft hug. "Macedonia." Creole's voice broke this brief comfort session. I looked up from Jacob's chest and whimpered softly upon seeing him there staring back at me. "I take it that it didn't go well?" Creole asked with a smile still on his face. I shook my head and gripped Jacob as if he was going to save me in some way. I'm sorry, sir. He came out of the painting and..." "Who was that?" I asked as my thoughts ran at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Jacob produced a napkin from his pocket and offered it to me. I took it and wiped my eyes and blew my nose. "That would be a lovely associate of mine, Constantine Sinclair. He doesn't take too kindly to my antics, I'm afraid. Unfortunate that you weren't able to get those items. I would have loved to have that kind of information to hold over his stupid blonde hair." Creole sighed as he sat down behind his desk. "Where even were you?" I asked as Creole looked at me. He smiled at me and watched as Jacob continued to comfort me. He seemed to watch us for a moment as he digested the question that I had just asked him. "I was at a lovely dinner with my other associates in Sinclair. It was going just about as well as it normally does when Sinclair suddenly stood up from the table and immediately headed towards the door. "I take it you must have tripped some kind of alarm," Creole said with a laugh as he began to drum his fingers on his desk. I stared at him for a moment as I tried to figure out in my head where he could have possibly had some sort of alarm. Then I remembered the painting. Was there something about it that he could see through it? Was that how he had been able to see me inside his mansion? Jacob helped me stand back up and bowed to the two of us before leaving the office. Creole stared at me with those giant buttons for what felt like an eternity. I was sure that he was going to do something horrible to me for this second failure to complete a task for him. Welp, a deal's a deal, Mace. He shrugged his shoulders as he leaned back in his chair. You're free to go. He shooed me away as he looked down at his desk. I stood there in shock. Surely it wasn't going to be this easy, was it? Just as I turned to leave, though, he stopped me. There is one more thing, though. The tone in which he said this sent a chill up my spine. He was giddy with excitement and also ominously followed by low chuckles. Your daddy came to visit me the other day? I spun on my heels quickly and stared at him. He was resting his head on his hand and smiled at me. The smile was one of superiority over me. He begged me to help with his financial situation, and I'm inclined to help him. Of course, if he doesn't think his wish over thoroughly, I'd hate to see a repeat of your friends and Jacob. He threatened me as he drummed his fingers on his desk. Stay away from my family, I warned him, even though I had nothing to back it up with. He giggled at that and stood up from his chair. Or what? You'll call the police? You'll kill me? He hummed and shook his head. How about a trade? I spare your father and your mother for good measure, and you become my permanent errand girl. His gross yellow smile sharpened into fangs as he stared at me. I clenched my fist tightly. I had no choice. He had every good card in the deck. He had a royal flush, and I had a one-of-a-kind. I wanted nothing more than to rip his head off, maybe even go back and try and work for the blondie. But I was stuck here now in this moment. I want it in writing. I don't want you changing the deal, I demanded. He nodded quickly and reached behind his desk to produce a contract. Feel free to read it. He slid it across the desk toward me. I walked over to it and looked down at it. It was everything he had told me beforehand without any fine print for me to read. He offered me a pen and twirled it around his fingers as I stared at it in thought. How long for? I asked him as I took the pen from him. Until I get bored with you, he said with a smile. I stared at him and then down at the paper. I love my mom and dad more than anything in this world, including myself. So I signed the paper. I watched as my signature melted into the paper and turned into gold letters on the page. Wonderful. You're free to go home. Don't worry about Sinclair either. I'll handle him. He shooed me away as he rolled the paper up and caused it to disappear from his gloved fingers. I silently left his office in complete defeat. Jacob was waiting at the door for me and he opened it for me. Thanks, I mumbled to him as I left the shop and started my way home. This was my life now, stuck in a contract with a horrible voodoo monster with no possible way out until he got bored with me. I had no way of escaping this. All I had going for me was that for now, my family was safe. And really, at the end of the day, that's all I wanted. Thank you for watching the video fully. Please hit the like and subscribe button, since I could not make these videos without your support, and it means the world to me.